Hello, and welcome to Technology and the Opening of Trade. I'm Eugene Cornelius, Senior Director for the Center of Regional Economics at the Milken Institute, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. Before joining the Milken Institute, I served as the Senior Executive for the U.S. Small Business Administration, overseeing all 50 states of the Union and U.S. territories, as well as 21 export centers. My experience has shown me the benefits and challenges that SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, have with export. Today, we're going to talk about it in detail with a distinguished panel. But I must put out some facts very quickly. The benefits of exporting can never be as clear as they are. 25% of U.S. exports, that's over 500 billion U.S. dollars, and over 6 million U.S. jobs are created by exporters. Exporters tend to hire twice as many employees as non-exporters. And there's tremendous growth opportunities in this area with 95% of the consumers and populations outside of the United States. But exporting is not just manufactured goods. 70% of exports are in the service industry. And however beneficial these are, there are some extreme challenges with them. SMEs need access to finance, trade financing in particular, which is much different than domestic financing, technical assistance, and guidance in markets. And though technology provides access to capital, a recent survey showed that 75% of exporters, SMEs in particular, are not aware of the digital resources available to them. With that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. Marion Jansen is the Director of Trade and Agriculture with the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Marion is Canada's Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion, and International Trade. Kevin Smith Ramos, partner AGON, and former Mexican chief negotiator for the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. And last but not least, Fred Hochberg, former chair of Exim Bank and former deputy of the U.S. Small Business Administration and the author of the recently released book, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. It's a very good read, and I hope that you all pick it up. Let's start with an opening question for all of the panel, and then we will dive into a deeper discussion individually based on your experience. The first question I have is, when we think about technology and the opening of trade, are SMEs more affected by domestic policy or international trade agreements? And give me a reason for your answer. I will start with the OECD.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for this question, and thank you for having me with you today. I'm a diplomat, so I will answer in a diplomatic way. I will say they both. It is, of course, for a company, for an SME, important to be able to compete, to develop a competitive type of offering. And for this, the national policies matter a lot. In my previous position at the International Trade Center, we developed this concept around companies have to be able to compete, connect, and change. Competing means they have to be able to develop an offering that is of the quality, the price, the quantity, and the timing that is right for the market. They have to be constantly connected to information that helps them to build that kind of offering, and they have to be able to change if that's necessary from the market. Domestic policies matter awfully for this. Access to finance matters for investments. Access to skills matters in order to be able to develop a competitive type of offering. access to IT infrastructure matters in order to be digitally connected.
I'm the minister, I'm Canada's minister responsible for both small business and for international trade. So my mandate really is to help Canadian companies start up, scale up, and access new markets. Startup and scale up, of course, is domestic and creating the right conditions here in Canada for our businesses to be successful. And it's many of the things that Marion talked about. But in fact, what you set out in your opening remarks, Jean, around the challenges and the opportunities that exist for small and medium-sized businesses. So you need to have the domestic environment to help our businesses be successful. And those would include, how do you help them get better access to capital? How do you create the right public policies and different kinds of instruments and the right kinds of support for your domestic companies to grow? But international policies matter a whole lot. So Canada touts itself as the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other one of our G7 partners. And that is about creating the access to customers that our businesses are going to need. Now, when you talk about small and medium-sized businesses, you're absolutely right. There is an inherent difficulty for those businesses to get access to those international markets. So whether it is digital and having the right environment to be able to pursue that growth is one part of it, but making sure that they have the support in market that is sales and business development, as we do with the Canada's Trade Commission Service, but making sure that while they pursue those opportunities, that they indeed are successful. And I think there's also a role that not only our Canadian multinational companies can play, and certainly Canada in its relationships with other countries through our multilateral agreements or bilateral agreements, is to create that value chain or that supply chain so that we can deliberately perhaps some of our businesses and our small businesses into those value and supply chains, so that in that growth in the international marketplace through our multinationals, Canadian SMEs can also pursue that growth. But it is a lot of work, and I think governments, in the way that they put supportive policies both domestically and create those opportunities for access, but then the follow through in terms of their success in market in those countries, in other countries, in the international market, is absolutely critical and important.
Okay, thank you. That was very well, and I'm going to have a supplemental question because of that answer. I really appreciate that. So, Ken, let's hear from the negotiator. What do you think?
Thank you very much, Eugene. First of all, thank you to the Milken Institute for the invitation, and it's a real honor to be here with this distinguished panel today. Well, I mean, it's a very appropriate question, because there's always a question of how to help SMEs compete, and there's a domestic and the international dynamics that go into effect. I would say that until recently, what we have noticed is basically that it was the domestic policies that really affected the ability primarily of SMEs to compete. Everything having to do with the regulatory environment, the fiscal environment, the efforts that the governments can make on training, capacity buildings to help small and medium-sized companies, especially micro-sized companies, to be able to compete. In the case of developing countries, for Mexico, it's very important to get the micro enterprises to become part of the formal economy. So there is an extra effort that the government needs to do domestically to have that happen. And of course, the efforts to try to internationalize these companies. Now, what has happened in the new generation of trade agreements is very interesting, because until the recent generation of trade agreements, such as the CPTPP, USMCA, Mexico's new agreement with the European Union, the focus was on general rules for trade that affected all companies, right? So, but in the new generation agreements, there was a change in the rationale. First of all, to try to modernize the existing trade agreements. In the case of Mexico, the agreements that we had that were over 20, 25 years old, and that did not reflect the realities of technological progress and information technologies advancing. So modernizing the agreement was a key element to that. And jointly with that was the effort to make the trade agreements more sustainable and more responsible. So in the case of Mexico, for example, in our trade agreements, the objective became in CPTPP and USMCA and other agreements to have more micro and small size companies participate in international trading activities. So this became essential, and it has always been essential, because in the case of Mexico, over 95% of our businesses are micro and small businesses, and small by Mexican standards. I mean, what the US or Canada considers to be a small company is in Mexico pretty much a medium-sized or large company. So the international dimension has become more and more important, especially as we introduce these new disciplines into the trade agreements. New chapters such as how to help small and medium-sized enterprises become international companies, how to take advantage of good regulatory practices in our main trading partners, such as the US and Canada. What have they done to help SME develop? Improved elements in the trade agreements that facilitate trade by taking advantage of information technology, so reducing costs of doing business at the border, and of course, strengthen intellectual property provisions that promote innovation, help to adopt technology, which is key. Because in countries like Mexico or other developing countries, there's always a misperception that if you're a micro and small size enterprise, you automatically have to be low tech. And that's a big mistake. Nowadays, trade agreements can help you develop those capacities to be able to adopt new technologies and to take advantage of them. And that's only talking about the traditional channels of doing trade. What we're seeing nowadays with the growth of digital trade is a true democratization, so to speak, of international trade. Because in the old days, a micro enterprise or a small entrepreneur had to go through the traditional commercialization channels, for example, to enter the markets in the US and Canada, struggle to try to get the big retailers in these countries to notice them, probably force them conditions in contractual conditions of very low prices or with impossible volumes to comply with. Worse yet, some of these companies, if they wanted to enter the US or Canada, for example, they would have to go and open offices there, which because of the lack of credit would be very difficult for them to accomplish. Now, with the new technological tools and with the growth of digital trade and the rules that are being established in the trade agreements, small and micro-sized entrepreneurs, for example, in Mexico, are one click away from accessing millions of consumers in the US and Canada and other countries with whom we have FTAs, basically having a laptop and a server. And all this opens a new array of possible small and micro-sized companies to become part of the trend to enter international markets and to take advantage of FTAs. I would leave it at that. But the most important part, I still believe, is the support that you bring domestically for creating institutions that can help SMEs become competitive, to get rid of obstacles domestically, such as competition practices, anti-competitive practices that prevent small and micro-sized enterprises from entering the market and, of course, from blossoming into companies that can export. So I guess the conclusion of the intervention is basically you need both. You need a strong domestic environment and to help SMEs become aware of the new tools that are being introduced in free trade agreements to help them become exporters.
Mm-hmm. Very good. You two have, we have Marion back. Thanks. Welcome back. And we're going to continue the route, and then we're going to come back to you to let you finish your statement. So, Fred, what is your view? Is it affected more by domestic policy or international trade agreements?
Well, I think there seems to be a lot of agreement here. I think it's mostly domestic policy, to be honest with you. And part of that also is in many countries, less so in the United States or Brazil and countries like that, but when the domestic market isn't large enough, entrepreneurs are in some ways forced to look overseas, forced into exporting if they want to keep growing their business. Certainly, that is true in Europe, and much more so than even in the United States, where we have such a large market. So I think, as the minister said and others have said, I think that the domestic policy has a lot to do with it in terms of access to finance, access to innovation, access to the kind of workforce that would build a company that would have international standing and products and services that are desired on the international market. So, yeah, I would tilt towards the domestic first.
So, given your answers, and I have to say I'm more with the domestic side of the policy on this question, but I want to ask a question because Ken and the minister brought up something that's very interesting when we talk about trade agreements. But we see a change in the landscape for trade agreements. They're becoming more bilateral versus multilateral. They're becoming more regional trade agreements versus the global or hemisphere kind of agreements. So with that, with this change in the landscape, that countries are pursuing these bilateral agreements, that lends itself to a hodgepodge of different policies and agreements that small businesses would have to navigate. How do you feel about these regional agreements versus multilateral agreements? And we will go back to the minister because you kind of brought that up in your question. Yeah.
Sure, Gene. So, I mean, Canada has, we have both. We have multilateral agreements like the Canada US Mexico trade agreement, which is a modernized, upgraded agreement that includes terrific provisions that include greater access for small and medium sized businesses, that promote inclusive trade, that has strong both environmental and labor standards. And you know, another couple of great multilateral agreements we have, one with the EU through CETA, and another that Mexico also shares along with Canada is the CPTPP with the Pacific Rim countries. And then we have a whole range of bilaterals as well with countries like the Ukraine or Israel and many others. I think we total about 14 agreements here in Canada. And so the job really is on the one hand to ensure that we continue to provide greater access to markets for our Canadian companies and for those SMEs. So in the new agreement, I think the provisions that are in there really allow for greater access in a much more deliberate way. And back to sort of what we need to do domestically is it's about export readiness. It's about making sure that we have the tools here to help Canadian companies understand where it is that they, you know, where those opportunities are, and you know, and to do the job here as well to help them understand what the better, better market access and where in, you know, where in the globe might be better suited for their growth. And then with digital and e-commerce, I think it was already said, I mean, with a click away, some businesses, in particular the small businesses, are able to do business in a way that is very different today than it would have been before. But I would also kind of take us to, you know, perhaps just another macro view, which is that the multilateral rules-based trading systems need the work, I think, of all of us. And I think about the WTO. I think that the work that needs to reform and to modernize the WTO is an important piece of work that that countries like ours are all working on. Canada actually leads a group called the Ottawa Group, made up of many like-minded countries, but Mexico's there, the EU is there, Australia, Singapore, Kenya, so just a range of countries, which really is digging into what does the reform look like, and why is it important? It's because WTO reform really can reinvigorate the negotiation function that that will have rules that actually reflect the 21st century realities that all of our economies are facing. The other thing too is that multilateral negotiations, as a whole membership, is something that the WTO has a role in, and we need to understand what that could look like in a reformed and modernized manner. So I think the overarching point I make here is that whether it's multilateral or regional or bilateral, what I think guides us will serve us all well is a strong rules-based multilateral trading system, which is really critical for long-term economic stability, for growth, for prosperity, and that growth and prosperity and trade yields in a much more inclusive way to everyone in our economy, which in developing countries that must include the micro-sized businesses and small businesses in all of our economies and countries. And I would say now more than ever, as we all are needing to recover from COVID-19, that multilateral rules-based system is going to be essential.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I totally agree, and I want to hear from Ken. In your answer, this came up as well. Regional agreements, multilateral agreements. How is this trade landscaping changing how we do business and trade?
Well, it's very interesting, Eugene. I think I agree completely with the minister in terms of the importance of the multilateral trading system and to create rules for everybody that can benefit, across the board, all sizes of countries, regions, and types of enterprises. That is essential and something we should work on. In fact, there is a theory out there, of course, that has been pursued by economists from Joseph Stiglitz and others that talk about the importance of trying to have these multilateral rules rather than this spaghetti bowl of different regulations and rules throughout the world. But the problem is one of theory versus practice. What we have seen over the last few years or decade now is a paralysis in many areas of advancing the Doha round. The WTO ministerials have not yielded the results that all of us would like to. So it is inevitable for countries to try to push the envelope and to advance on a bilateral basis, whether it's in our immediate regions or doing deals like with the CPTPP. But it does not mean that both elements are divorced. I think it is very positive that we're seeing progress and relatively quick progress in negotiating areas such as digital trade or new provisions on intellectual property, trade facilitation to help reduce costs for micro and small enterprises to export in these agreements. Because one thing that happened, you must recall, with the NAFTA originally, is that the original NAFTA very helpful in pushing forward the program that led to the creation of the WTO. And a lot of the agreements that exist today in the WTO are modeled on a lot of these provisions that were established in the NAFTA. We feel that something positive along those lines can happen today as key trading regions such as Asia Pacific and of course North America are advancing on some of these key provisions that had never been introduced before in trade agreements can actually now be translated into multilateral agreements. I'll give you an example how it is much more difficult to advance in the multilateral arena. When we talk about negotiations on digital trade, which of course, for example, in the USMCA, they are very useful because they, in terms of specific provisions, they prohibit any tariffs on electronic transactions. They don't have a server localization requirements, which of course reduces costs dramatically. It changes some of the customs provisions on allowing for a higher level of de minimis, so that facilitates smaller transactions, commerce transactions without being subject to taxes or tariffs. A lot of this is very useful and we advanced rather quickly, or well, I mean, it took a year and a half, but we got it done in the USMCA. All of these discussions are taking place now for a couple of years in the WTO, in the digital trade negotiations that are going on, and that encompasses over 80 countries. And yet it is difficult to advance. And the challenge there is because you have to reach consensus between so many countries with different levels of development. And while these discussions continue rather slowly at the WTO, we hope the pace will advance. The reality out there is that technology is much, much faster than the government's reaction in terms of regulating or establishing trade rules. Already the digital trade chapter of the USMCA is different and has new elements that are not included in TPP, an agreement that was negotiated just a couple of years before USMCA, precisely because the technology is advancing so quickly. So we're going to have to find a way for the WTO reform to take into consideration these technological advances and to be able to, in a way, change its internal rules to be able to react quicker to the technological change that is occurring throughout the world and to be able to bring all of these countries together to have multilateral agreements on these issues. But especially when it comes to technology, that's the big challenge that we face internationally when we talk about the WTO. How quickly can the WTO move to react to the reality of the changing regulatory and especially the technological progress that is occurring across all these disciplines?
Well, hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I want to dig down into really about this new technology and digital trade. So, Marion, now that we have you back, welcome back. I want to ask you the question: how do new technologies and digital trade promote growth for SMEs? What role will they play in our recovery?
Well, so I hope above all that I'm digitally well equipped enough to stay in this session now. Going digital may be absolutely key for the recovery after COVID-19. We have seen that many parts of the economy only kept functioning because of digital technology. We have seen workplace mobility go down by around 50% in many places. So people would not be going to their job anymore. They would be working from home, only possible because of digital technologies. We have seen the use of bandwidth increase by around 25% in many countries because of the increased use of digital tools in order to continue to function during the crisis. So going digital has been key during this crisis. It was key before, and it will continue to be key in the future. How does it help SMEs? It helps SMEs to trade above all through things like digitalization of trade process. Everything that's a fixed cost to trade affects small and medium-sized enterprises more than large enterprises because they have a lower level of revenue to recover fixed costs. So if it takes you 5 days to go through the border, that's more of a problem for a small enterprise than for a large enterprise, rather than if it takes 2 or 1 day. If you have to go to several places to get paperwork, that's more of a problem for an SME with a small number of people than for a large enterprise that has a department only dedicated to these issues. So digitalization at the border, digital transactions at the border, digital processes around documentation are very, very beneficiary for small and medium-sized enterprises. By the way, they are also very good for women, for female-led enterprises. Digital processes make the process more gender neutral. And we have found that it makes it easier for female enterprises to conduct business, including international, through digital processes. And then there's, of course, access to information that is facilitated through digitalization. So this can be access to information on where your customers are, what they would like to use, what they would like to buy, whether there is demand for the type of product you have, or simply access through digital means, through customers that you couldn't access before. We have, for instance, seen a boom in creative industries from certain countries in trade in creative industries because of digitalization. Before, for many African or island economies, it was absolutely impossible to sell music or to sell movies abroad. That was far too costly because the number of users for their particular product is small in each individual country. But if suddenly through streaming you can sell to all of these people across the world at the same time, it's suddenly possible to have a large enough market for your particular product. So digitalization can offer new access to markets. It can give more easily access to information that SMEs need. And above all, it can lower the transaction costs, including and in particular in international trade. And that's important for small and medium-sized enterprises.
Thank you. That was well thought out. I really appreciate that answer. So, Minister, let me ask you going forward, given what Marion just said, technological advances happen quickly. And how does these trade agreements keep up with and create these opportunities like she mentioned about live streaming? What else can be done to assist them?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And I would agree with everything that Marion says. I think about what we are trying to do here, even in the midst of COVID-19, how important it is to create a sort of greater digital capacity for our Canadian SMEs is sort of something that we're quite seized with. I mean, so in some of our emergency measures, for example, I mean, even as recent as yesterday, together with our Prime Minister, I made an announcement in collaboration with our chambers so that we can actually create greater digital capacity, sort of, to be able to do e-commerce in a much with greater ease, and just be able to develop that capacity for us domestically. So, I guess part of this is you got to sort of continue. We've got to continue building that capability domestically, and just to give people a frame of reference. I mean, Canada as a country, we are large geographically. We are probably about the size. We can fit 40 United Kingdoms in the size of Canada geographically, and yet in population, we're equivalent to the size of the state of California. So you could, so not, so in terms of people, it's not as populous, and in geography it is. So therefore, the opportunity, even for us to do business and for businesses, around the country, to stay connected, to be ever more digital, to have those access points is absolutely critical, and we need to continue doing that work. And then the agreements that we have negotiated of late. The new NAFTA is a very, very good example. The provisions in there that actually enable small and medium-sized businesses, services sectors, emerging knowledge-based companies, and to have the opportunities in there to grow and access into the markets, is absolutely essential. And then what we've done here is just make sure that we also have a range of what I would call sort of supportive tools, from helping with access to capital through our business development bank, making sure that those businesses that are looking to export are supported through the Export Development Bank of Canada, which is really about export financing. I think someone said how difficult it is. It is difficult, and especially for small businesses which aren't into the space, and we've got to create that capacity and awareness, understanding, and then making sure that when they're in market, so our Trade Commissioner service, which I call Canada's best business development and sales team around the world, because we operate in 160 offices around the world, making sure that there are sort of those boots on the ground to help to help those small businesses truly access benefits of that new market access, are a range of what we need to do, building on what is available through digital. And I guess maybe that final point is, how do we sort of make this happen in real time? In November, I am sending a virtual trade mission of women-led entrepreneurs and business owners to South Korea, and given the trade restriction, the travel restrictions right now, and how everyone is being very conscious about COVID-19 and how we operate within this pandemic environment, we believe that we're not going to let COVID-19 stop us from trading, but we are going to try to find some new modalities. And I think the virtual digital trade is one area to which we are looking to pursue, and probably ever more needing to do more of that.
Okay, thank you. So, Ken, I'm going to come to you because Muriel and the minister brought up something really interesting. So, and that is, when we talk about technological advances, how does the WTO catch up in their trade agreements, like the USMCA, the CPTPP? How do they catch up with this technology? How do they catch up with the modern way we were doing it? And what else can be done to democratize trade?
Well, thank you very much, Eugene. I think that the key is something that the minister touched upon, which has to do with the urgent necessity of WTO reform. I think that a lot of the things that are going on at the WTO right now are very positive. I mentioned briefly the digital trade negotiations, so that should be a priority to try to advance and finish that, because that is linked to the overall. It's not the only element, but it's linked to the overall efforts to try to make the WTO more responsive to these needs of incorporating new technologies into trade rules. So I think finishing the digital trade negotiations is very important. I also believe that we need to have a discussion internationally. This is an area that I've worked a lot in the past, so perhaps I'm a bit biased, but we need to have a discussion both at the WTO, at the OECD, at other places, on how to strengthen competition rules throughout the world. I think what we're seeing now, and there's quite a few books out there now talking about the increased concentration of very, very large companies in different sectors. Right now, the DOJ is starting a case against Google. Airlines have been in the midst of this forever. But if you really look at the level of concentration that exists in terms of big mergers of companies and how these become obstacles for small and micro-sized enterprises to enter into their domestic markets, but also to be able to export. I think that's a discussion that we also need to do and to have. The OECD has a great competition committee. Of course, these issues are discussed as well at the WTO. But I think that overall, to really make substantive progress here, you will need WTO reform in the way that the decisions are structured. I think that the fact that it's a member-driven organization, what we're seeing is right now a call to arms, so to speak, by Deputy Director General Alan Wolf, that requesting, different regions, different countries to provide ideas as to how this reform should be conducted. The European Union recently came out with a sort of three main priorities, which is, of course, fixing the dispute settlement mechanisms and having a strengthened secretariat and personnel to be able to do this. Of course, in general terms, relaunch the global negotiations. And there's a third element that's very important. I think that's where SMEs and technology fit in, which is this third pillar, which is making the WTO aware and the need to make trade more sustainable and leveling the playing field. And rather than looking at the traditional tools, which is eliminating tariffs and providing special differentiated treatment for goods coming in and out of countries, I think this is where a discussion should be held on the importance of promoting the adoption of technology, especially in developing countries, and how to have small and micro-sized enterprises be able to have access to technology, which also means access to capital and be able to become international companies. Referring to Deputy Director General Wolf again, he mentioned that technology has changed how we trade. And I think that makes it essential or imperative, for example, to have a concrete example, that trade rules need to adapt, for example, to the economic transformation of the fourth industrial revolution. What we have seen in the last 10 years is a marriage between information technologies and advanced manufacturing. And this is here to stay, and it's here to stay across different sectors, whether you're talking about precision equipment, on medical equipment, aerospace, automotive, etc. And I think that that's something that we really should include in the discussions that take place in the WTO. Continuing talks again on digital trade. Investment facilitation is an area where I think the WTO could really try to strengthen the provisions that exist and really engage high-tech issues having to do not just with digital trade in terms of how we have approached them in the FTAs that we have now in place, which I repeat are very useful to advance the disciplines and establish sort of a blueprint of where to go. But to start discussions on key issues, for example, how do we go about regulating, or both domestically and internationally, key services such as cloud computing, which is becoming essential nowadays. And I don't think the trade rules, either bilaterally or at the WTO, are right now equipped to address these issues. So these are some of the issues that I think the WTO should address. But in order to do so, we really should put the foot on the gas issue of WTO reform, because frankly, the way it is structured right now, the way these negotiations take place, I mean, it could take years. By the time the digital trade services negotiation ends, it might be too late because technology is advancing very quickly.
Very good point. I think that it is time for us to update the WTO, which is why I wanted to ask you that question. I want to go to right quickly to Fred, and I want to ask you, Fred, before I ask you my general question to you, I want to ask you another question, which you related in your book. And the reason I'm going to bring this up is because we're talking about technology, and we're talking about recovery, and we're talking about the UN estimating that we're going to need about 50 million jobs each year for the next 15 years. So there's going to be winners and losers, as you said in your book. Fred, could you explain how that plays into this economy with technology and disruption?
I'll take a crack at it. Thank you. Trade has winners and losers. Every policy government takes has winners and losers. In our country, if you own a home and you have a mortgage, your interest is deductible. If you rent an apartment or a home, it's not deductible. So there are always going to be winners and losers. And in the trade area, I think that we overlooked people who lost out. And our economy was growing very rapidly, so on balance, we were still creating in the US about 1.5 million jobs a year. And even if you take some of the high estimates of what NAFTA hurt the economy, which is not agreed upon, but if you just for argument's sake, it's still overwhelmed by the number of jobs we created. What we didn't pay enough attention to is communities that got hollowed out, towns that got hollowed out, people's lives were upended, and we just said, well, on balance, this is good, and therefore we don't really have to pay attention to it because it costs money to do so. We have something called trade adjustment assistance. It's not really been fully funded, and it was a rather cumbersome product. It was actually started by JFK, John F. Kennedy, when he was opening up free trade in the 1960s. So we need to just have a more robust view of that. One of the things I discovered in writing the book, one of the people I spoke to used the term lifelong readiness. We talk about lifelong learning, but for many people who have not gone to college, the happiest day of their life may have been the day they graduated high school. So the idea of going lifelong learning is kind of a non-starter. But lifelong readiness makes sense. We're going to have a hurricane or a bad weather. You better stock up on food and fill the car with gas. So how do we stay ready to meet a digital economy? How do we stay ready that skills that we're always finding ways to improve our skills? Companies have a role to do with that. Government has a role, and employees have a role to sort of seek that and also push their companies to do that. So I think those are some of the ways that we sort of make sure we can, by creating those jobs and also making sure people are skilled and ready for them.
So if we are to say that, I look at the United States and we have 13 different agencies that deal with international trade. How do we coordinate that in to be ready to create the environment for lifelong readiness? How is that done?
Well, I think the two things you mentioned there in terms of trade. One of the things President Obama tried to reorganize government, bringing together the Export-Import Bank, the SBA, Commerce, and so forth. That's really, really, really hard to do. But one alternative would be something called, maybe we have a trade cabinet. That's really only maybe 8 or 10 agencies that meet on a regular basis. President Clinton had a version of this called the President Management Council that really were the number two at 20 odd agencies that looked at how do we manage the government better. We could do that in trade. We could do that in a number of things coordinated from the White House. That would help. And Gene, as you mentioned, every agency I can think of all have their own training programs. And it's bewildering to both companies and individuals to try and navigate that and sort that out. So we could certainly do a far better job. And, some things are the Labor Department, some things are in the Department of Education, some things are at SBA, where you and I work, some things are at Export-Import Bank. Finding a way to make sense out of that so that people could navigate that in a thoughtful way would go a long way.
Yeah, I think that is confusing to the average small business owner who doesn't have the time to do a lot of research to find out which government agency is there. I think we need to create a point of entry for exporters to get into the magnitude of services that the federal government provide, from SBA to Commerce to Exim Bank and the like. Minister, I want to go to you. How is Canada? Is there separate agencies? Is there this silo attempt? Are you coordinating these things? Is there a one-stop place for entry for small businesses who want to go into exporting?
Yeah, I think that the commentary just earlier is one that probably is common among many governments. Before this portfolio, I was just the Minister of Small Business, and the Prime Minister in this in this new appointment put both small business and international trade, and then in between export promotion. So it has and therefore I have two very large departments. One which is one which is international trade, and then the other is which is essentially Industry Canada, Innovation and Industry Canada. So the entire the supportive network and work that that the federal government has to support small businesses is in one part, and of course all of our apparatus to help our businesses and support them internationally and to grow internationally, and doing the trade deals is in the other part. But now there's one single minister, me, that that does this work, and in addition to the departments, we have crown corporations, and these corporations are designed to do different things. So the Business Development Bank is what we would call the single bank for Canada's entrepreneurs. But it's a business development bank, which is a crown corporation of government. I have that under my responsibility. I also have Export Development Canada, which is the export finance piece. I have the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is the government-to-government contracting agency that facilitates and contracts government-to-government type contracts that essentially provides the private sector or businesses, most of them large, but many smalls as well in that value chain or that supply chain, that now come together. Invest in Canada, where we look at foreign direct investment that come into my portfolio, and then of course the entire team of trade commissioners work around the globe, as I mentioned earlier, to help our businesses. So we are attempting absolutely for sure to create a much better experience. And of course, Canada is a country that where we have a federal government, but we also have territories and provincial orders of government and municipal orders of government, all of whom also have departments or support entities that help economic development in much more local jurisdictions, comparable to states or city level governments in America. So the challenge of making sure that, I like to say that there should be no wrong door. I would like small businesses to come into the government of Canada and to experience a no wrong door, and that the effort we need to continue to work on is building this ability for them to come in and get access to what they need in a way that is responsive to them. And it is absolutely a commitment and absolutely a work in progress. And we try to also provide digital tools. I have a Business Can app. So businesses sort of go in there, and that should be their one their one door. But it is very, very much a work in progress, and we're gonna keep working at that. But it's very, very much worthy to do, because Canada, I think, no different than all of you. I mean, 99% of our businesses are small and medium sized enterprises, and they employ many Canadians, millions of Canadians, and there are job creators, and we see this as a absolute opportunity for, obviously, their continual survival right now during COVID-19, but certainly in this economic recovery and beyond, it's our opportunity for growth.
Yes, we here in the United States, thank you for that, have 68 district offices under the SBA. And under that, we have a umbrella of counselors and trainers, the SBD, Small Business Development Centers. And they tend to be our open gate for import export of SMEs. But we also have Exim Bank that gives a reference based on country and the level of risk related to the country, given export. And I think that if we create a what they call one-stop shop versus not going to commerce, not going to customer service, or going to SBA or Exim Bank, but we have just one-stop shop for exports, I think it would help navigate the small businesses through the difficulty of that exchange. So I'm curious to see what's going on in Mexico, Ken. How is Mexico handling this?
Thank you. Well, I mean, until the end of the last administration of President Enrique Peña Nieto, the responsibilities for support for SMEs were essentially located in the economy ministry. Yeah. So on the one hand, there was the Entrepreneur Institute, which concentrated on capacity building, developing skills for, of course, providing access to credit and preparing them to be able to export among and to grow domestically. On the other hand, in the same ministry, we had ProMexico, which was the trade promotion and investment attraction agency. Both of these agencies, under arguments of austerity, were disbanded by the López Obrador administration. So now the responsibilities have been maintained in the sense of the SME support within the Ministry of Economy, but under a program that has much lesser budget and no longer a formal institute dedicated to that. And the trade promotion activities and investment attraction that can definitely benefit SMEs tremendously have been shifted to the foreign ministry. So it's still a work in progress, not clear how that's going to evolve. I recognize that there were a lot of things that could have been improved in the institutional structure that existed in past administrations. But the problem was that this was completely disbanded as this administration came into power. So different groups, including our firm, we have a proposal to create an interagency commission in Mexico to promote trade in general and to help SMEs through a mechanism similar to what Fred was mentioning, sort of a trade cabinet, which comprises different agencies that are involved in this issue: the Office of the Presidency, the Trade Ministry, Foreign Ministry, and Finance Ministry primarily, along with some of the independent regulations on the Competition Commission and some other key domestic regulators, where you can, on the one hand, promote the benefits of trade, help companies understand what are the advantages that exist from the existing trade agreements, and also to ensure compliance. And that's very important, ensure enforcement of trade agreements, and that there is no disconnect between the country's international trade obligations and individual decisions that certain cabinet ministers could be taking that may be contrary, for example, to our commitments on USMCA or the WTO. So having a single window on trade in general, but specifically on support for SMEs would be very important in Mexico. And our recommendation has been to not disband the existing institutions, but rather strengthen them. You can re-engineer them, but they need more budget. They need to have more fluid access to capital, and to be able to take advantage of the provisions that we instituted, for example, in the USMCA, on having greater cooperation with the U.S. government, with the SBA, with their counterparts in Canada. We do need that domestic architecture, those institutions in Mexico that are well funded, to be helpful to micro and small enterprises. So it is a work in progress in Mexico. I think that a lot can be done to improve it, but the first thing that the government has to do is realize that they may be able to reduce the budget in other areas, but they actually need to increase the budget when it comes to SME support and promoting trade and attracting investment into Mexico.
Okay, thank you. We want to give notice to our attendees that the Minister of Canada had to leave for a very important vote, and so she appreciated the time with us, and we appreciated having her with us, but she had to go and do her job, and we are thankful for that. With that, I'm going to come to Fred. Fred, I want to come back to your book. I want to ask a question because based on several discussions in there as you gave out the history of policymakers and how we come to conclusions on trade, which is really soft democratic or democracy, uses it as a tool. If you had your way, what would be the one policy, the one focus you think policymakers should focus on now in this ever technology changing world that we're in?
Goodness. Well, I think in America, I think what we need here is we need to, one thing that Vice President Biden is talking about, and it applies to trade as well, we need to find a ways to come together. When we've done trade deals in the past, they often pass by one vote, razor thin margins. That at the end of the day has not been good for a democracy. So I think building a broader consensus around trade, understanding what it does, what it doesn't do. That was one of the reasons I wrote the book, to try and say, here are some of the advantages, here are some areas we have fallen short, and understanding them, and understanding, as you mentioned earlier, Gene, there are winners and losers, gives us a fuller understanding. And I think that would help long term, because I think what we've seen is that many people, particularly lower income and lower skilled workers in wealthy countries, like we're talking about right here, have really been hurt. And so just saying trade is good, they really don't buy that. It's impacted they have reaped advantages when they go to the supermarket and the store to buy clothes, but they don't often connect that with trade. So I think that we need to sort of broaden that out much more so. And I think that would go a long way towards making trade be seen as a positive force in our society, which I believe it is, but understanding it's not 100% positive and it's not 100% negative.
Thank you. So, and you raise a good point, and I want to go back to Marion, because what you do is across countries, and in emerging markets, that what Fred just said, which is happening in the wealthy countries such as the United States, is impacting. When we get a cough, they get a cold. What would be your number one focus or number two focus with policymakers as we look at developing countries and the alleviation of poverty using trade?
Well, first, when it comes to the emerging and developing world, I would say that we see currently much more enthusiasm for globalization there in many parts of that part of the world than we are seeing maybe in the industrialized world. I would like to highlight that Africa is just embarking on a major African integration project under the African Free Continental Trade Agreement, and I feel have felt a lot of positive dynamic around this in a continent like Africa. If you ask me what we need most for voters and for small and medium-sized enterprises to believe in trade again, it's to create an atmosphere of trust. When I look up to small and medium-sized enterprises, they need to believe that they can work in a stable environment. Changing policies every few months, every year, does not help them to do business. They cannot afford to make an investment and lose it. So it's trust and stability, trust in level playing field. Ken mentioned this. Small and medium-sized enterprises cannot navigate different types of rules. They do not manage to take advantage of different kind of obscure and opaque type of treatments. Small and medium-sized enterprises want to know that if they pay taxes, the big ones also pay taxes. That if the big ones get subsidies, they also get subsidies. Level playing field is important. If one country helps, their country has to help too. So creating a trust that SMEs can operate in a stable and level playing field environment will be very important for the future in order for business to want to believe in globalization again. And I think that would also be the case for ordinary voters.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I think that on this note, we will end because we're running out of time. There's so much more we could discuss on this issue, and hopefully we will have further sessions on this topic throughout the Milken Institute's wide array of centers. We have 10 different centers that focus on health, economic, finance, and quality of life, and all of which is affected by trade, of course. We have a vast research center here at the Milken Institute, and we're going to be taking some of the comments that you just made here and seeing what we could do to develop workable solutions and advise our policymakers here domestically and internationally. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining the call today and to express your expertise in this area. And I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to be here with us today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.